Hey, Jeff. Hey, bud. No need to call me back. Just wanted to call and give you a heads up. I no sooner hung up the phone with you, and like 2 or 3 casts later, dude, I had the biggest stream brown on it I've ever had on the Rogue. The thing was well over 20. It was a tank. It was an absolute tank. Came out of the water. I've seen it and everything. Just long enough to see him, and then the hook spit out. Crying tears as big as horse turds. Just wanted to give you a shout, let you know, buddy. Talk to you later. Bye.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Remote No Pressure Podcast. Super excited that you guys are all here today. Hope you enjoyed that intro by my father-in-law, John, who gave me a fishing report from his trip on the Rogue. It was hilarious voicemail, so I thought I would share it with you guys. If you guys catch a fish or you want to give a fish report on what's going on, all you do is use your iPhone or your Android device and record a little fishing report for us and email it to me, jefft@remotenopressure.com. Again, jefft@remotenopressure.com. We want to hear those stories. We want to hear what's going on out there. It's the fall. It's the best time of the year. This week has been an unbelievable week for us here at the Remote No Pressure Podcast. Our local Fox 17, our Fox News affiliate, Fox 17 came out and recorded here in the studio. You could actually take a look around at what's going on. And if you go to our website at remotenopressure.com/blog, you can actually see the story and you can actually see where we work and what we're doing and why we're all here, what prompted us to start this podcast and why so many people listen increasingly every single week. It's just phenomenal to see the numbers and just what's going on. It's super excited. So feel free to go over to our website there and check that out. This week on our Remote No Pressure Podcast, we have Mr. Ken Morrow with us. And when we talk about dealing with stress and post-traumatic stress disorder and all of these things, this guy literally wrote the book on all of this. And it's available on Amazon, and we have some links up as well. Fantastic. Now, the first part of the podcast, I mean, this is actually a longer podcast than normal. And the first half is a little heady. He goes into statistics. He talks a little bit about what he did. Really smart guy. And the very, very end of it, it's just a lot of fun to hear him just cut up and loosen up. But one of the things that he pointed out is about fly fishing is what happens when we have an expectation of a positive outcome. And that is just a fascinating thought. An expectation of a positive outcome and how that affects the people who fly fish, who may be going through a lot. It's a fantastic interview. Welcome to the podcast. Let's light the fire. Today on the Remote No Pressure Podcast, we have Ken Morrow with us. Thank you very much, Ken, for spending some time with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Ken, the reason I reached out to you, you have a couple of books out, and what we really believe in here at our podcast is just accessibility to fly fishing, and you actually have a whole book about that called the Adaptive Fly Fishing Handbook. And I've read your bio, and I kind of understand some things that may have motivated you to write that book. But can you tell our audience a little bit about what that book is about and what led you to create that book?
Yeah, sure. The book is basically a primer, if you will, for practitioners of therapeutic and adaptive fly fishing. And what I mean by that is the people who are putting together programs and helping and guiding and mentoring and teaching fly tying and that kind of stuff for various types of communities of people with special needs. All the way from I've worked with organizations and people dealing with children with severe cerebral palsy, all the way to um, you know, cancer recovery support groups. So, and just about, well, a wide variety of things anyway in between. So, and basically, um, where the book came from was a meeting that I had back in about 2008 with some very senior people from the Veterans Administration and from the military morale, welfare, and recreation departments, and they were specifically wanting to take some of the volunteer grassroots-driven programs like Project Healing Waters and institutionalize those within their organizations. And what they expressed to me was that they wouldn't be able to do that with just grassroots fundraising and volunteers. And they explained to me very clearly how they would quickly outrun that and burn out volunteers and that kind of stuff, because they wanted programs in-house and operating 5 days a week, all day, every day, that kind of stuff. So it suddenly took something that was, a passion that people in other careers were doing out of the kindness of their heart with their spare time, and was turning that into more of a full-time vocation. And that was the intent and the desire at the time on their parts. And so they kind of asked me to help create a training and curriculum program for certification and just to kind of standardize things in a way that would, for lack of a better way of explaining it, that would satisfy their bean counters, and meet some sort of compliance guidelines. And so I actually myself, and I talked about this extensively with a lot of people, and 3 people agreed to join me in actually making that, trying to make that a reality, and a whole bunch of other people said, you need to do this. I was looking for other people, like within the fly fishing community and stuff like that, to kind of take it on, and everybody just kept saying, no, you need to do it and I'll help you, so that's sort of the background on where it came from. And then, I actually, it took a few years for me to actually write the book and get the book published and that stuff. But but all along the way, I had a very good opportunity, an active opportunity for experimentation and refinement and all of that kind of stuff, just because of what I was doing it as a volunteer, so eventually that turned into the Adaptive Fly Fishing Handbook. And it's not a like a formula kind of here's exactly how you do it sort of book. It's not meant to be an exhaustive, like how-to manual. It's meant to convey what I found to be the principles and the guiding concepts, and a few, maybe a half dozen examples of things, on a very concrete level that are how-to, but more by way of example of illuminating those principles. So it's really just to kind of get people started and get people thinking about it, and in an organized fashion, and moving in that direction is what most of the book is about. But then the first 2 chapters of the book are actually kind of aimed directly at those clinicians and those institutional leaders in the healthcare industry that that kind of gave them what they needed in terms of research and everything, kind of compiled into one place, to give them the justification to allow, say, for example, a physical therapist to, if a physical therapist walks into their boss and says, "Hey, I want to learn to fly fish," on the clock. The first two chapters of the book are designed to give them the leverage and the tools that they needed to actually make that make sense in a clinical environment.
What are the benefits of that? Learning how to fly fish, you said like on the job or whatever. What would you say are some of those benefits, or how have you seen, especially with wounded warriors or people who've experienced traumatic accidents? What kind of change or how has fly fishing affected those? Do you have a couple stories you could tell us?
Yeah. Firstly, let me just kind of give you the just a straight up more kind of clinical answer, and then we can talk about anecdotal experiences. But in essence, you have. Are you familiar with the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross grief cycle?
No, I'm not.
The Kubler-Ross grief cycle is to the field of psychology what the alphabet is to an English teacher. Okay, it's foundational in the field of psychology today. Are you familiar with what about Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yep.
Okay, those two graphs and the body of information that behind those two graphs are pretty much psychology 101. Okay. So the Maslow hierarchy pyramid and the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, and so at any rate, what happens when somebody experiences any kind of a traumatic event that results in long-term or permanent disability, those people are going to go through the early phases, or the denial and the anger and those things, and then they eventually end up depressed. And it's the coming. The Kubler-Ross model is a sine wave, if you know what a sine wave looks like, so everybody goes through that cycle, and when they get into the mourning and the depression phase and the what Kubler-Ross called the bargaining phase, there's a lot of depression. There's a lot of dark mood and thinking that is a normal part of that process. And generally speaking, medical rehab doesn't address the psychosocial rehabilitation. It only addresses the physical side of rehabilitation. I'll give you an example that I used in the book. I actually broke my left thumb really badly when I was a teenager. And I was playing sports, and it basically destroyed the base knuckle in my thumb. And of course, the doctor says, well, squeeze a tennis ball 500 times a day. Well, I can do that, and I'm a more persistent and stubborn kind of person than most, and but there was no way I was going to squeeze that tennis ball enough to get back to where I could open jars again and things like that. It literally took more than a decade for me to get to where I could open a jar.
Wow.
But what we found is that through using what is clinically called outdoor experiential therapy, of which therapeutic fly fishing is just one modality. What we found was that there were ways to kind of trick people into leaning forward into life again, and that they could and what I mean by that is we just taught them that they could still have fun.
Sure.
And so that's where the recreation therapy comes from. There's a guy, and he's this is kind of a well-known quote in fly fishing circles, but there's this old guy named John Bouchon, and he ended up being the first Baron Tweedsmuir and the Prime Minister of Canada, but he was just the son of a, Scottish minister, very modest family background. He was intelligent, and he suffered a severe injury when he was a child, and his parents sent him to his grandparents' home in the country in the south of Scotland. They were sheep farmers. And he eventually recovered, and he spent all of his holiday time with his grandparents in the south of Scotland. He eventually graduated from school, and like many young men in his era that just finished their education, went off to fight in the Boer Wars, and then stayed in the military through World War I, and came back just a complete wreck. And I mean psychologically and emotionally, and he went back to his grandparents' place in Scotland. It was the only thing he could think of to do. And he said the meadows and the forests and the seas have always been my best medicine. And so he went back there, straightened himself out over several years. He was a great friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. And I'm sure you know about Teddy Roosevelt's outdoor adventures and stuff all over, the place. But that was his primary outdoors adventure companion, was John Bouchon for many, many, many years, and eventually he became the Prime Minister of Canada. John Bouchon said that the magic of fishing is that, and I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit, but is that it is the quest for both the elusive and the attainable, and a perpetual series of occasion for hope.
Wow.
Well, I'll ask you, what is depression?
Let's say
the absence of hope.
Oh, okay. Sure.
I mean, that's why people get so depressed they can't get out of bed. That's why people give up on everything. And it's just because they just don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. And so one of the things that I discovered very quickly when I started working with some of these wounded troops that were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan was that I heard several of them say it. They said, when I hooked into that first fish, or when I landed that first fish, it was like I was hit by a lightning bolt, and everything in my life changed.
Wow.
And so I started sitting down with them and talking to them about that and saying, what is it? What changed? What changed? I figured out I could have fun again.
Wow.
See, they're all sitting in these rehab units in these hospitals, squeezing the tennis ball.
Yeah.
Bending their legs, walking, between the poles, holding on to them, all that kind of stuff in a clinical, in a rehab clinic. And they're getting poked and they're getting prodded, and somebody's coming in and waking them up in the middle of the night to take their temperature and their blood pressure. And this goes on for months and months, and they have dozens and dozens of surgeries and all this stuff. And nobody ever bothered to address their most basic fundamental fear, which was that this was what life was going to be like from now on. It's going to be this living hell.
Wow.
And so we'd take them out of that hospital and take them fishing. And They catch a fish, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, I can have fun again.
Right.
And now they go back to that rehab clinic and they start leaning into the rehab work because they can see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Wow.
And so that's where recreational therapy really plays a key role. And obviously, while a guy's still laying hooked up to a bunch of machines and all that kind of stuff, you can't do much of that kind of thing. But when they get to the point where they're ambulatory and they're moving around the hospital and they're going to clinic appointments and they're going down to that rehab clinic and they're exercising every day and that kind of stuff, then you can start to do some of that sort of stuff. And really, if you think about it, what John Bouchon was saying is that it's the pursuit of the elusive but attainable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, between you and me and the fence post, catching a fish really isn't all that difficult. But there's a mystery to it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think back to the first time anybody ever took you fishing, like if you were like me, it was my grandpa, and he took some sliver of something gross or a piece of corn or whatever and put it on a hook below a bobber, and you flung it out there in the water, and he said, now watch that bobber, and if it moves, you lift up that rod and you'll catch a fish.
Right.
And you're like, okay, so you throw it out there and you kind of watch the bobber, and you're kind of having trouble struggling watching the bobber, you get bored, and then all of a sudden it moves. and you lift the rod tip up, and lo and behold, there's something wiggling on the other end and pulling the other way. And here's the real magic of this, okay? Because what is fishing but the repetition of that cycle over and over and over and over again?
Mm.
Okay? So what you have done immediately is you've started reprogramming the depressed brain to hope again, to expect a positive outcome.
Wow.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And it literally rewires the synapses of the brain and starts reconditioning it. The more fish you can get them to catch, the better. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
I actually kind of refined this down to, and this is what I talk about in the book. I'm like, cheat, go stock a pond with like 500 bluegill.
Yeah.
And take 5 or 6 guys out in wheelchairs and sit them on the edge of the pond and just let those guys wear those bluegill out.
Right. Yeah.
Because the more they catch those fish, every time they're casting it out there, they're hoping that it's going to move, and that if they just lift that rod up, they're going to catch a fish. Now, of course, every once in a while you miss one and all that stuff, but the point is, you're redoing that over and over and over again. And whether they realize it or not, it's power of positive thinking, okay? They're doing something, expecting a positive outcome. That outcome gets rewarded, repeat, okay? And that literally, if there's a whole field of psychology called cognitive behavioral therapy. That's what this is all about, and it's one of the most effective forms of therapy for treating post-traumatic stress disorder, by the way.
Wow.
I don't mean the fishing, although it is, but I mean the whole field of cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's exactly what it's all about: is reprogramming the brain out of this cycle of depression and this cycle of malaise. And reprogramming it in ways to expect positive outcomes, because when people have an expectation of positive outcome that is constantly being reinforced, then they start trying harder and harder and harder. And so your outcomes from rehabilitation therapy improve dramatically.
Wow. And
in the clinical environment, quite frankly, this is all like brand new. It's like the light bulb went on from this light bulb was really starting to go on in the medical world really just over the last 20 years. And that's where things like music therapy and art therapy and play therapy with children and stuff like that, that's where it has all evolved from. So, but as far as the fishing goes, interestingly enough, the military medical community was using fly tying for fine motor skill rehab, hand and arm and eye-hand coordination rehabilitation in military hospitals, both the Army and the Navy during World War II.
Mm.
But
Wow.
somehow or another, after World War II, they forgot how effective it was.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody had done it again until a couple of guys, a couple of vets living in the D.C. area wandered into Walter Reed Army Medical Center back in like 2004 and said, hey, we could like show up here 1 or 2 days a week and, teach some of these guys to tie flies. And, that's how Project Healing Water started.
Wow. That is something.
So, and then all of a sudden, one of these doctors at the hospital actually went and did some research. He went and like looked some things up because he saw that it was working.
Wow.
And so he went and did some research, and so he came into the guy who was teaching the fly tying class, and he says, hey, guess what I discovered? We used to do this back in World War II a lot. So,
wow.
So that's kind of, it's kind of interesting. It was kind of a lost thing for a long time. And then, but the field of outdoor experiential therapy, there's only a few grad schools in the country that even teach this in counseling programs and social work programs and stuff like that. But most of us from mainstream America and European life, if you think back through your childhood, you had some sort of a summer camp or summer vacation in the outdoors experience that was very formative for you. Mm-hmm. And, most of us share that kind of an experience somewhere. And to a large extent, that's kind of a, the field of outdoor experiential therapy is that they kind of figured out, they're like, hey, you know what? These people are, once we get them to where they can, once we get them to where they can function a little bit again, if we put them in the outdoors, there've been over 100 medical studies done that prove conclusively that if you just show somebody videos of nature, like National Geographic Channel, okay, or, while they're in the hospital, or if they have a window where they can look out on green trees and nice fields and forests and or water or, any kind of a nice nature view out their hospital room, their outcomes are significantly, substantially, clinically superior to those who aren't.
Wow.
So the healing and restorative powers of nature is something that has kind of come back into medicine here over the last 2 decades.
Wow.
And it still hasn't really, really taken hold, but I could give you some examples where pieces of the medical community have embraced it at great cost. I mean, we're talking millions of dollars just for one hospital to add this nature element to their rehab programs. The VA completely remodeled American Lake out there in Washington State. It was a big VA hospital. They shut the whole thing down for several years, did a multi-million-dollar rehab on the place. And guess what they did? They put in a trout pond and a golf course and a horse stable.
Wow.
And then they reopened it for nothing but veterans with severe post-traumatic stress disorder.
Jeez. That's awesome. That's
so,
awesome.
That's just one example of what I'm talking about. And I spend the first 2 chapters of that book going through that whole deal, and I explain the American Lake thing. I explain how all this, comes together. I cite all those studies. I make the case for, and then I make the case for why fly fishing fly fishing is pretty simple. We already went through that repetition thing, but also it's fairly low impact and it's fairly low risk as far as recreational activities go.
Mm-hmm.
So, so that has a high appeal rate to hospitals, insurance companies, and that sort of stuff. Because we're not talking about going skydiving. We're not talking about going scuba diving. We're not playing football.
Right.
You know, we're we're going to go out and sit on the edge of the pond and catch some fish. You know.
Yeah.
So that's that gives a real edge to fishing, and fly fishing in particular. Another real key piece of this whole thing is you have to measure this risk versus reward, risk benefit thing. You have to balance that out, but you want there to be a sense of an adventure. That's a big part of the outdoor experiential therapy model. Is it has to seem, even if it's pretty normal, it has to seem like it's not. So everybody knows that it's not a real big deal to go take a Snoopy pole and a bobber and some worms and catch fish.
Right.
But fly fishing, only 2% of the population even tries it.
Wow.
Okay. And so with fly fishing, they feel like, wow, I'm doing something that, most people don't do,
Right.
And the simple, I mean, honestly, again, just between me and you and your fly fishing listeners on your podcast, we all know that actually catching a fish on a fly is not really, doesn't take any superhuman skill sets or, it really isn't all that much harder,
Right.
It's more involved. You're more engaged in the process. But you don't have to be really strong. You don't have to be really fast. You don't have to have, Spider-Man reflexes or, although that one helps a little bit, but, but really, let's face it, it's not like it's any really, really difficult thing, but it has a perception. Fly fishing has a perception of being the hardest kind of fishing.
Right.
And so that factors in as well, because that sense of accomplishment is really important fuel. So if they feel they're doing something that a lot of people who aren't in wheelchairs, or haven't just lost an eye, or, if they're doing something that even most normal people, quote unquote, don't do, then it gives you an even bigger sense of accomplishment. If you think back to the first time you picked up a fly rod and started fly fishing, when you started to get the hang of it, you kind of had that same sense of pride.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, anybody can go catch fish, but, let me see you catch that on a fly rod, bub. So, it's just, I mean, it's just real. And if we're going to get real and talk about helping people that are struggling with serious issues,
right,
then, I mean, let's just be honest, those things are all real factors. And so why fly fishing is really, and this is the way I ask it in the book in the end of those 2 chapters to the clinicians, is I'm saying, I say, so while we started with the question of why use fly fishing, I'm going to end it by asking you, why not?
Right.
So it's not the only modality that works, but it is a really, really good one.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like one of 2 or 3 of the most fun, but that's a matter of personal taste.
Yeah. It's funny that you're I'm so glad we're talking, Ken, because I started this podcast, started planning it. I didn't know anything about podcasting really. I didn't know what to buy. I didn't I didn't know a whole lot about it. But the reason I started it and the reason why I had to do this it was because I was extremely stressed at my job and I worked in finance. And I don't know if you listened to any of our past episodes, but um, I had to go get some professional help from a psychologist who told me you need to take up a hobby. And I ended up, I just looked online. I had this old Bass Pro fly rod that I won from a sales contest at work. And I said, what the heck, I'll go try this. And a lot of people, a lot of my listeners don't know this, actually, unless you're really close to me. But I was in a very, very bad car accident with a drunk driver when I was 11 years old, and I have a prosthetic hip, and I'm not like in a wheelchair or didn't experience. I was in a wheelchair all through middle school, either a wheelchair or some kind of crutches or walker, something like that. So I can't go play football. I can't go. I can't play rugby or go for a run. But I
Right.
figured I can go fly fishing. This is something I can do, and it saved my life. I mean it changed my life, and I said I've got to tell people about this. And sure, I had no statistics, Ken. Actually, I didn't read up on it. I didn't research it. I just know that it helped change my life. And now that you're on here, and listeners, I want you to know we didn't talk much. We exchanged a couple emails, and I read his bio and stuff. So Ken didn't even know this either. So this is the first time I'm revealing it on the
Right.
podcast. But you are
Yeah, I
justifying.
had no idea. In fact, I probably, if I had known your background, I probably would have abbreviated a little bit of some of the descriptive stuff, and just said, as you well know,
Right. Yeah,
but
but there's a lot of listeners out there that don't, that maybe not they don't know. But it was the fly fishing thing that like saved my life. I was so under so much stress, and I'm like, I got to do something. And you're
well,
everything that you're saying is exactly what I experienced. And I'm just like I'm without words right now, Ken. It's amazing.
Jeff, let me tell you where I started. Okay. And not fly fishing, because I actually started fly fishing when I was about 13. But I didn't do it a whole lot for a number of years. You get busy doing other things, and traveling, and all that kind of stuff, and so that but it was something that was it was a hobby that was in my closet, but the in 1992, in the line of duty in the military, I suffered a bad fall, and had a pretty significant brain injury and broke a couple of vertebrae in my neck. And how this whole involvement with fly fishing as rehab therapy happened for me is, at the time, nobody caught the busted vertebra in my neck. They were worried about the head injury. And somehow or another, nobody even looked that far down the x-rays and stuff. And I could still move my head. So I got out of the military, and I went on with life, and I knew I had a stiff neck and all this kind of stuff, and had some neck pain and some headaches and whatnot, until about 2000. And I got out in 93. But in about 2000, I woke up one morning and one of my hands was numb, and I never got the feeling back in it. And over the course of the next 2 years, I got worse and worse and worse, to the point where I couldn't feed myself. I could not I had to drink coffee out of sippy cups.
Wow.
And because I was having convulsions and constant tremors, and I had lost all my fine motor skills, and I was getting really, really irritable and depressed, and didn't know what was wrong with me, and was afraid to go find out what it was. In about 2003. In fact, I think it was New Year's Eve of 2003. I think I made a New Year's resolution for 2004 that I was going to go get some help. And that's when my rehab journey started. And in the course of talking to some doctors and them going into my medical history and all that stuff, they were like, oh my gosh, well, you had this really bad head and neck injury. And they sent me in for a bunch of scans and all that stuff, and they found the broken vertebra in my neck, and that was impinging my spinal cord, and that was what was causing all the problems with my arms, and and so to make a long story short, I spent the next 10 years in intensive rehab.
Wow.
And I literally was to the point where I could not feed myself safely. I would jab myself in the eyeball with a fork. Trying to put a piece of food in my mouth, and things like that. And I was falling, like if I had to get up in the middle of the night, go get a drink or go to the bathroom or anything like that, I would bounce off the walls, fall in the bathtub, wreck everything in the house, because my balance had gone, and I was always very athletic. And, I wasn't like the greatest in the world at anything, but I was pretty athletic. And so this was really, really traumatic to me. And I was in my mid-30s. And so I went back to the fly fishing because my wife and my doctor said, we got to find something that you do. I was extremely depressed. I wasn't leaving the house for anything but doctor's appointments.
Wow.
And my doctor said, we've got to find something for you to do. We've got to find what do you still enjoy? And I'm like, well, I can't tie my own flies on the line and stuff hardly at all anymore, but I like to go fly fishing. I just don't do it. It was like, go fly fishing every freaking day. Make yourself go fly fishing.
Wow.
And my wife said, and why don't you start tying your own flies? And so I did. And and I mean, teeth, hair, and eyeballs all over the fly tying table. It was ugly, for the first, few months. But eventually got to where I was within 6 months, I was fishing with nothing but flies that I tied myself.
Wow.
And I was, and I was back to where I could tie knots in tippet and, tie the hooks on and, tie the flies on the line and all that stuff. And it was taking great concentration, and I was having to use deep breathing exercises and all this kind of stuff and a bunch of little, other little tricks and things that I just figured out on my own because I didn't have a physical therapist.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so I just, I literally just fished my way back to some semblance of normalcy. And it really was just my little old country doctor and my wife that, said, hey, do the fishing thing, let's tie some flies,
That's awesome.
And so that was about 2004 when that started. And in 2006, a couple of guys that I had met because I'd gotten more, I was going fly fishing almost every day. These guys that I had met were teaching a fly fishing PE course at the third largest public university in Missouri, which was just up the highway from me a few miles. And they're like, why don't you come team teach this course with us? And so in 2006, I started, helping them teach. It was 4 or 5 of us. And I started, helping teach this class at Missouri State University in Springfield. And that was my first experience with teaching fly fishing and fly tying at all. And I had done that for 2 semesters, and an old friend of mine, guy that I'd been friends with since before he knew that I fly fished, as a matter of fact, Rick Pope, the owner of TFO,
Yeah, he's been on the podcast actually.
Okay, well, I actually knew Rick from the Spring Book trading days. I knew Rick when he launched TFO.
Wow.
And he sent me 4 of his first Pro Series Lefty Cray endorsed fly rods just because he wanted to get some out there to people, and he's like, Ken, do you fly fish? I'm like, yeah, I fly fish. It's like, well, let me send you a rod. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, which size do you want? And I'm like, well, I really can't decide between a 4-weight or a 6-weight. Well, he sent me 2 4-weights and 2 6-weights and tubes, and, but at any rate, that was probably back in about 2004, 2005 when that happened. Well, then in 2007, I'd taught 2 semesters or 3 semesters of this class, and he contacted me because he had met the guys from Project Healing Waters at Walter Reed in Washington, D.C. And he contacted me and he said, Ken, you need to get in touch with these guys because Rick knew my story. We were buddies.
Right.
And so he's like, you need to get in touch with them. And because I think they're talking about taking this to other military and VA hospitals and stuff, not just the Walter Reed program anymore. And I think that's something you should do. So I called, and that guy that I mentioned earlier, who was an old grizzly Army warrant officer vet who was teaching the fly tying at Walter Reed, answered the phone, and there was because Rick gave me a phone number, and this guy answered the phone, and I told him who it was, and that Rick had told me to call, and I said, and I'm down here pretty close to Fort Leonard Wood, and the nearest VA hospital is a couple hours from here, but we have a clinic out on the edge of town, and I was just wanting to know, if y'all have got anything going on in my area, and he said, we do now.
Wow.
And I said, well, who do I get in touch with? And he said, it's you, dude.
That's awesome.
So the next thing I know, I've got 8 programs running in 5 different states, and everybody's calling me the regional coordinator, just because I just never said no. And that's what led to that. That's what all led up to that meeting in Memphis that I mentioned at the beginning of this thing.
Wow.
The other piece that was a big motivator for me with the Project Healing Waters thing, quite frankly, is, I had 2 older brothers, a nephew, and a wife that at this point are all disabled Iraq and Afghanistan war vets.
Wow.
And I was I was kind of sitting around doing my own thing. I couldn't go back in the military after 9/11, and because of what had happened to me. So I'm kind of sitting around, and I'm like, well, I'll tell you what really happened to me. I thought, one of my family members could end up in one of these hospitals. And I was wrestling with that and deciding, I'm like, maybe I should do this. And the old nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty, came into my head. And I'm like, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. But you know what? I'm going to try. That's my commitment or my contribution,
Yes.
is to help pick up the pieces on the backside.
Heck yeah. Yes.
And so that's really what made me decide to get involved. And the rest, as they say, is history. I mean, that's just what happened. I spent a number of years while my wife was making deployments to Iraq, and my brothers and all of that stuff were running back and forth to Iraq and Afghanistan. I ran all over the United States.
Wow.
Teaching wounded troops to fly, fish, and tie flies.
Wow. That's amazing. It's out of those tragedies that that life is really born, you know. Um,
Right.
I talk to people all the time. It's just like this crazy thing happened to me, and then I found my passion, or I did my part, or I found what I was, this sense of calling in my life because of this horrible tragedy that happened to me.
Yeah. I always tell people this, especially young people. All of the best jobs that I've had in my life, the ones I really enjoyed and that I really excelled at, I fell into them by accident.
Wow.
I mean, I'm not saying I wasn't necessarily looking for a job when I found one or two of them, but um, but I was, but but like I had no intention of going to work for these people. You know,
Yeah.
I had no intention of making that career change. Um, but but I've had like three or four just really really awesome, fun, fulfilling, good paying jobs that just they just happened. It wasn't because I sent anybody a resume or went and filled out an application or anything like that. It was just it literally was just a conversation that I had with somebody. In one case, while I was in college, I took this retail job that just turned out to be really, really, really beneficial. And I just needed a part-time evening job. I was going to college, but I walked into a store that I frequented as a customer, and I walked in as the store owner was slamming down the phone because one of her key employees had just quit.
Hmm.
And she offered me a job right there on the spot.
Wow.
It was a great job.
Mm-hmm.
It
Yeah. Yeah.
it was an awesome job,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it helped pay my way through college.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was, that was the first one of those, you know, but most of the others that I can look back in my life and say, wow, those were really fun. I wish I was still doing that, were just pure accidents.
Wow. Well, there's a lot. First of all, thank you very much for spending some time with us, Ken. As as we start to wrap up, let me ask you this question. There's a lot of people who may be listening, who may be wounded warriors, who may be on not the other side of tragedy where you are, but maybe they're going into it. Maybe that someone's listening that's really beat up at work. Maybe they're managing this home life, and it's just really overwhelming. Or maybe they're struggling with depression, like we had talked about earlier. What is something that you would tell them? I mean, you're on the other side of all of this. I mean, um, obviously your life isn't over or anything like that, but you've gone through a significant amount of tragedy in your life, a significant amount of hardships. What would you say to encourage those who aren't quite on the other side of those things?
Well, um, unfortunately, Jeff, I'm gonna have to preface this by saying that finding the light at the end of the tunnel can be extremely difficult by yourself.
Hmm.
That often takes some form of intervention, and we just have to be honest and forthright about that. But I will say this: it's never going to happen while you're sitting on the couch with the blinds drawn. You've got to go let somebody know you need help. You have to. And I don't care if it takes the last bit of energy, the last bit of gumption that you have left in your soul. You got to crawl out the door and start waving the flag and get somebody's attention. Because there's a whole aspect to this that we haven't talked about, but in these veterans programs in particular, in these military, the wounded troops programs, a real secret to the success of everything that I've done is that I used a veteran to veteran peer mentoring model. I went and got Gulf War veterans and Vietnam veterans and Korean War veterans who fly fished. and I talked those guys into being the core volunteers in my various local programs around, because they were like what you said about me. They had been through it. They'd been through the same things. Guy had stepped on a booby trap and got his leg blown off in Vietnam, and, you know, had 2 Purple Hearts, and he had PTSD. But you know what? He's retired from a great career. He's got a beautiful house. He's got a wonderful wife and kids and grandkids that love him. Go fishing with that guy. Okay? Because that's how you start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Is you look at, you know, you spend a little time fishing with somebody. You know, a good friend of mine always used to say, you never really know a man until you've spent the night in a tent with him. You know, and I've found that to be profoundly true. You know, it's like, you know, if you you know, you spend some time fishing with a guy, and pretty soon you're going to look at this guy and you're going to go, yeah, you know, I mean, his injuries were almost as bad as mine, or maybe even worse, or whatever. But, and if this schmuck can pull it off, surely I can do it. You know?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? It's like familiarity breeds contempt, you know? It's like, because once you start to see somebody's warts and all that, you know, and, you know, it's like, you know, that, you know, you might think this guy is a retired vice president from Exxon, you know? And so you're thinking about all this stuff, but when you go fly fishing with him and you see him stumble and fall down in the stream and break his fly rod into 6 pieces, and his hat floats down the river, his favorite hat floats down the river, and he's never going to see it again. At that moment, he's not the Exxon vice president. You know what I'm saying?
It's the great equalizer. Yes.
Right, exactly. And so it's in that moment that young vet who just came back, who's still trying to figure out, he's wobbling around on that new prosthetic leg, goes, if he can do it, I can do it.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely.
So that whole piece of it, I just got to be really honest with you. I'm not a real I am a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're deep down in the funk, most people, by the time they realize they're there, they need a hand out of that hole.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you know, go to a church, call a counselor, something, you know, even if you don't have any money. I didn't have any money. I'd been off work for almost a year when I said, well, I got to go to the doctor.
Right.
Well, I ended up going to a rural healthcare clinic. Didn't cost me a dime. I didn't have insurance.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. And I know a lot of corporations too offer 2 or 3 visits to a psychologist for, you know, it's free or something. There's a lot of those benefits for some of the large corporations, you know, and that's how I started. I mean, I ended up going more than 3 times, but the first 3 were free. And I'm like, I have got to get help. And I sought help, and it was amazing what it's done for me. So, yeah.
And,
so,
and it's not, and I'll tell another little secret here too. It's not like these shrinks are really all that much smarter than the rest of us.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're necessarily, you know, some of them don't have their act together either.
Sure.
But having somebody who is trained in systematically thinking through stuff and listening to what you're saying and asking the right questions helps you to format your own reprogramming in a way that you can't do just by yourself.
Right.
You know, and that's, you know, it's like, you know, it's like if you got a broken leg, you know, you're probably not going to walk to the hospital by yourself.
Right.
You know,
right.
But you might get there if you just have somebody to lean on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's the way I like to think of mental health professionals, because, you know, any good ones will tell you real quick they don't have all the answers.
Right.
You know, but they have a method, and they have a system for, okay, let's start unraveling this ball of yarn, but we're eventually going to put it all back together, you know, but we kind of got to get this mess straightened out. It's kind of like getting the wind knots out of your leader, you know?
Yeah.
it's like you got to start unraveling this stuff somewhere, and if you can stay calm and systematically just pick it apart just a little bit at a time, it'll eventually all come out,
Yeah.
and so you've got to go get some help. And for some people, see, one of the things I talk about, back to the book again real quick, you can't just treat the physical. People experience trauma holistically,
Yes.
body, mind, and soul.
Yes.
And in the healthcare profession, they don't even want to hear the word soul.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to, so I mean, even if somebody, I use an example in the book of a little girl who her dad shuts the car door on her fingers.
Okay.
Her fingers aren't the only thing hurt.
No, not at all.
And in the big picture, might be the least of her problems. I mean, I've had my fingers shut in a car door and they weren't even broken.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but how her dad handles that situation and how her mom handles that situation for the next hour or two could end up psychologically scarring that child for life. And it's, you know what I'm saying? It's like you experience trauma in all three parts of your being. And yet everybody wants to focus on the physical part in terms of rehab.
Right.
Well, it's just not that simple. And that soul piece, that why, the answer to the question why should I take another step forward? Why should I go to that next rehab appointment? Why should I? The answer to that question, why, is the fuel for the whole thing.
Wow.
So that's what I learned, and that's what I do. And nowadays I do it through a variety of modalities. But it's not just, I don't just do the fly fishing thing, but it's, that's just what I do. Whether I get paid to do it or whether I don't really doesn't matter to me. Right.
Yeah. It's something you have to do. It's in your soul. So it has to come out. Well, that's great. Well, Ken, thank you very much for spending some time with us. You've got 3 books on Amazon. So you have the disability book. You have Bucket Mouth, correct? About fishing for largemouth bass.
Yeah, that's actually my most recent one, and it's actually about the trophy. It's about chasing trophy bass with a fly rod, because there's a difference between just going out and trying to catch a bunch of bass and going out and trying to catch one great big bass. It's a totally different approach, and that's really what the book is about. Is if you want to go catch a 10-pound largemouth bass on a fly rod, how do you do it?
That's awesome, and that's available on Amazon as well. If someone wants to get a hold of you, or get in touch with you about a book or have questions or anything, what's the best way for them to reach you? If you're open to that.
Yeah, I actually, people can hit my author page on Amazon. And that's, I mean, if you just, if you type Ken Morrow into the search box on Amazon, you're going to find me and the hockey player.
Okay.
So I'm not the hockey player,
Okay.
So that's and they can send me messages through there. I'm somewhat private for security reasons, because of mine and my wife's and other family members' previous careers. I don't do a lot in terms of putting my contact information, my address, where I live, that kind of stuff. I don't put that out in the public much.
Okay. Well, that's
because
fine.
we've had a few incidents. So
well, I will put your links to your Amazon page on our website so people can find you and purchase your book. And and learn more about you, because your bio is fascinating on there. So we'll be sure to do that. Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you.
Listen, it's been my pleasure, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you for joining us today on the Remote No Pressure podcast. Thank you so much for being with us. Be sure to check out our blog and find Ken's links to all of his books. Also, check out our store. We have a sweet, nice, limited edition Remote No Pressure decal designed by a local artist here, Jake Knoth, who's just a phenomenal artist. You're going to love what you see, and we love supporting him. So check it out at remotenopressure.com. Check out the store. Be sure to sign up for a mailing list. I think I got everything in there. And until next time, go fishing.